Okay, good afternoon, class. Goedemiddag, class. So what we're doing today is the demand for money, and we'll talk a bit about the supply of money. And so what you'll need is, we don't need it here, but I gave you notes yesterday, not yesterday, Tuesday, the printed notes. So you don't actually have to write most of it down, but maybe you just follow on there or follow with me. And then there's another handout. We will start with that as well today. And then just an important announcement, but I will send you an email about it. I'm putting a video on the South African Reserve Bank and open market transactions, and that you need to watch by Tuesday. But I'll put it on tonight or tomorrow morning, and you have the weekend and Monday to watch it. Then those of you who are watching from at home, I need you to open the documents on SunLearn, the money market equilibrium document, as well as we're supposed to have started. No. Okay, so people, if you can be quiet. So we're starting with the demand for money, and basically the demand for money, and I want you to think back to right when we started with demand and supply in the goods and services market, and you'll recall that demand is not the same as want or need. So all of you might want money, but you all don't have a demand for money. The demand for money comes when you actually have income or wealth, and there's something that you can actually convert to money. So when we talk about the demand for money, basically we're talking about the choice, the decision you make to either hold your wealth in real assets. So real assets would be things like fixed property, a Picasso painting, a Persian carpet, or financial assets. And for our purposes, we only refer to two types. We assume there's only two types. So you only need to know about money and then bonds. So what a bond is a bond is basically a loan that you're making to someone else. So it's a loan for someone else, but it's an investment for you. So for example, government bonds, if you buy government bonds, that's an investment for you. You get a return on it, and the government uses that as a loan, which you get back at a later stage, plus your return. So we will differentiate between either holding, if you want to hold financial assets, either holding it as money, which does not draw interest. So your money in your transmission or check account does not draw interest. It's not interest bearing. Or you can choose to hold it in bonds. And then also you can choose to hold your assets in real values and not financial assets. So basically what it comes down to is when you have a demand for money, you are choosing how much are you going to hold of your wealth in money balance form. So to give you an example, so let's say your great-grandmother dies and she leaves you 20,000 Rand. You can choose to hold that 20,000 Rand as money in your savings account or money under your bed, or you can choose to hold it, you can choose to buy bonds and then get interest for it. So not most people, but there's always that choice. Do I hold it in money or do I buy bonds? And there's an opportunity cost to holding money. So, and you'll see when we draw the money market curves, or the money market equilibrium even, you'll see that, remember, with normal demand and supply for the goods and services market, the price, you would have price on the y-axis and you'd have quantity on the x-axis. Now in this case, you will have I on the price axis because the interest rate is the price of money. What do we mean by that? What do we mean when we say the interest rate is the opportunity cost of holding money? So let's go back to that example about your great-grand who left you 20,000 Rand. So if you choose to hold the entire 20,000 under your bed or in a bank in a check or transmission account, what you are losing, what you are giving up is the interest you could have earned if the money had been on bonds instead. I hope you don't mind, I just want to check something. Sorry for the interruption. Okay, no, that is not what should be showing. No? Okay, so it looks like it's working fine. We hope it's working fine. On Tuesday, I forgot to click on share, and so they only heard my voice and they had a black screen. So hopefully this time a bit better. They can definitely see the screen. Now I'm just worried about, well, let's see. So there are two components for the demand for money. So when you demand money, the one is 'n transaction demand for money. So dat is twee komponente van die vraag na geld. Die eerste rede is die transaksievraag na geld. En die groot meerderheid of die grootste deel of gedeelte van die vraag na geld is die transaksievraag na geld. Ons het geld nodig om petrol in ons motors te sit, om brood of kledingware te koop. Ons het geld nodig om transaksies te doen. So the biggest part of the demand for money is the transaction demand for money. You keep money because you need to transact. So back to that example again of the 20,000. You're not going to put all of it in bonds. You're not going to buy bonds with the whole 20,000 because you need money to buy petrol. You need money to transact. Remember, one of the main functions of money is a medium of exchange. So you hold money rather than bonds or rather than real assets because you need to transact. Then you also know that money can be used as a store of value. So you can also have the demand for money as an asset. So you might decide to hold your money as an asset. Not the best way to hold an asset because you could rather hold it, you could rather buy bonds or do something else, buy financial instruments or financial investments, but there is that demand for money as well as an asset. So you might choose, okay, I'll keep some for transaction, but I'm also keeping some as a store of wealth. So John Maynard Keynes, remember him? You could say he's the author of modern macroeconomics. You had to write something on him in February, and we might refer to him again when we get to aggregate demand, the last section. But John Maynard Keynes coined the demand for money as liquidity preference. So what do we mean by liquidity preference? He means the demand for money is about keeping your assets in its most liquid form. What do we mean by liquid? We mean we can convert it easily to something else. So you cannot convert a Persian carpet or a piece of property quickly and easily into something else. You can do that with money. With money, you can exchange it easily for something else. Again, if you have bonds, you can't sell your bonds immediately. There's normally a maturity period, like maybe you bought it for a year or 3 years. So you can't, it's not liquid. But money, so John Maynard Keynes, demand for money, liquidity preference. So just remember L. The L stands for liquidity preference. We'll talk about this a bit more when we look at the graph. So we're talking about the demand for money, and we said, why do people demand money? Why would they? And some of it is common sense, and you might think, oh, this is so elementary and so simple. But we're getting to the graphs and the analysis part, so you need to understand the basics. So Maynard Keynes, what he did was he identified 2 reasons for the demand for money related to as a medium of exchange, and 1 reason which is more related to a store of value. The store value function. So the transaction motive, and very important note that each are related to something. So the top 2 are related to national income, which we'll talk about a bit more. So national income, we're talking about GDP, real GDP, the country's national income. So, and then the speculation motive related to the interest rate, which is inverse. But first, the transaction and the precautionary motive. So wat is die transaksie motief? Dit is weer eens om dinge te koop, om vir goedere en dienste te betaal. En dit is 'n funksie van totale inkome, nasionale inkome. Wat ons hiermee bedoel is dat as jou inkom en daar's 'n positiewe verwantskap. So indien jou inkome styg of indien 'n land se totale inkomens styg, dan sal daar 'n stygings wees in die vraag na geld. Baie belangrik om te hou. Om te onthou. So as die ekonomiese groei is, dit beteken dat nasionale inkomens gestyg het en dit bedoel dan dat daar toename gaan wees in die vraag na geld. So transaction motive, just for you and for us to buy goods and services, to transact. And the important thing here is, so we all know this, we all use money as a medium of exchange to transact. The important thing here is that it's a function of national income. What do we mean by that? We mean there is a positive or a direct relationship between the country's income and the demand for money. Direct means positive, so they move in the same direction. So if a country's national income goes up, people want to buy more. Consumption goes up, for example, consumption expenditure. So people want to buy more, and so the demand for money will also increase. So in periods of economic growth, high economic growth, we expect the demand for money to rise. The precautionary motive, what Keynes is talking about here, is kind of keeping money for a rainy day. Well, not rainy day, but so back to that example of the 20,000 that your grandmother gave you. So you want to keep part of it in money form and not buy bonds or buy some real asset, an expensive painting or something. You want to keep part of it in money form for your day-to-day transactions, and that forms part of the transaction motive, but you also want to keep it for precautionary motive. So what is the precautionary motive? This is for in case your car breaks down and you need to fix it. Let's say you don't have insurance, or in case you get sick and you don't have maybe medical aid or health insurance. So you want to keep some money on hand in case of emergency, or your geyser bursts and you need to call in a plumber. So this is a precautionary motive. So part of the money that you keep, remember, the demand for money is not about wanting money, it's about choosing to hold money balances rather than buy bonds, rather than buy real assets. So you keep some for precautionary reasons, for just in case, for emergencies. The speculation motive has to do with the inverse relationship with the interest rate, and you don't need to know this in detail, this gets a bit technical, but basically what it comes down to is when interest rates are low, people will hold on to money because it doesn't make sense to buy bonds if you're getting a low return, right? So when interest rates are low, you'll hold on to money because you're waiting for interest rates to go higher, and then when interest rates are higher, you'll buy bonds. So that is what the speculation motive is about, and that has a relationship not with national income, but here the demand for money is related to the interest rate. So how does this look in a graph? Why do I have this twice? Anyway, these motives, they all combine to form the demand curve for money. We'll see that in a moment. So the demand for money is a function of national income, positive related to national income, and the interest rate. Negative relationship with the interest rate. Think about it. Remember, you don't want to memorize, you want to understand. So when the interest rate is high, you would rather, it doesn't make sense to keep money as money in your savings account under your bed. Then you rather buy bonds where you can get a return on it. Who decides the interest rate? It's decided by the monetary authority. In South Africa, that is the South African Reserve Bank. So the interest rate is determined by the South African Reserve Bank. National income depends on how the economy is doing. It depends. So the level of Y, which is which is the abbreviation for national income, that is determined. Well, that depends on what the economy is doing. So you see the letter L. The letter L stands for liquidity preference, liquiditeitsvoorkeur. So instead of the letter D, the demand for money curve is a letter L. And you see there, it is a function. The F stands for function of national income, which is Y, and small I, which is the interest rate. And you see there's a minus under the interest rate. That shows you, this is just written in functional notation, but it shows you that there's a negative relationship between the interest rate and demand for money. So you can see that there. What does the graph look like? Before we get to the final graph, we're looking at just how it's derived. So the level of income in a country, the level of national income determines the position of the curve. It determines where the curve will be. So this is not the demand for money curve yet. We'll see in a moment. But the level of income, so important, take note of the labels. Let wel die byskrifte. So die prys in die geldmark is die rentekoers. Onthou, hoekom is dit die prys die rentekoers? Want die rentekoers is die geleentheidskoste van geld hou. As jy besluit om geld te hou in jou bank, in jou transmissierekening of onder jou bed by die huis, beteken dit jy gee die rentekoers of die opbrengs gee jy prys. Okay. Geen prys, is daar die regte woord, ek weet nie. Maar die prys, rentekoers. So baie belangrik, as julle vir my 'n grafiek gee van die geldmark, julle kan nie, dit is verkeerd om 'n P te sit. Dit is nie die prysvlak nie, dit is nie die prys van geld nie, dit moet die rentekoers wees en dit is klein e. En dan op die x-as is dit maar net M vir geld. So just in terms of the labels, let me just, very important, the labels for the axes for the money market. The price of money, you do not give me a P. If you give me a money market graph with the letter P, it is wrong. It has to be the interest rate. The interest rate is the price of money. And where does that come from? It's because it's the opportunity cost of holding money. Because when you choose to hold money in your bank or under the bed, wherever you're holding money in your wallet, you are giving up that interest that you could have earned if you had bought bonds instead. So the price is always the interest rate, and the quantity is simply quantity of money, which is fine. Now, this second graph, we're looking at the interest rate. We're looking at what determines the shape or position of the demand curve. So you saw in the previous graph that the level of income in the economy determines the position of the curve. So if income is high, it will be further away from the origin. If income is low, it will be closer to the origin. The interest rate determines the slope. So you can see here, determines the slope. But these are not the demand for money curve yet. This is what the demand for money curve looks like. It's just L1 plus L2. But all you need to know is, as you can see, it looks like a regular demand curve. Dit lyk soos die gewone vraagkurwe wat julle gesien het in die eerste semester. Dit het 'n afwaartse helling. Hoekom is daar 'n afwaartse helling? Want daar is 'n inverse of negatiewe verwantskap tussen die rentekoers en die hoeveelheid geld wat gevra word. The hoeveelheid geld wordt gevra. So you can see it looks like your regular demand curve that you saw in the first semester. It has a downward slope or negative slope. And the reason there's a negative slope is because of that negative relationship or inverse relationship between the interest rate and the demand for money. So there's a negative relationship there. And that is why it's a downward sloping curve. So I want you to practice on the handout that I gave you, not the one today, but yesterday's one. You're supposed to draw the demand for money curve, but you can draw that on your own at home. Before we get to the supply of money, have you got any questions about the demand for money? Enige vrae oor die vraag na geld? Anybody? Someone's got a question there? People at home, I hope you're getting this. Anyway, there's more people now. 7. So what type of question will I give you in a test? I could ask you a descriptive type question about what are the motives for holding money. More likely, I'm going to ask you for a graph. And the graph would probably look something like this. Now, first, this graph is in your textbook. It is box 14.6. And you'll note, so you see the money demand curve. You can see that there, the downward sloping L curve. So die curve wat afwaartse helling het, L, dit is die vraag na geld curve. Maar nou gaan ons die geld aanbod curve bespreek. Now we're going to discuss the money supply curve. So you see a vertical line. M1 is the money supply. M2 is just a different money supply, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So M1 is the money supply. And this is how the interest rate is determined in the money market. Remember with in the goods and services market, in the goods and services market, the equilibrium price was determined by the intersection of supply and demand. Likewise, in the money market, the equilibrium interest rate is determined by the intersection of the demand for money curve L, and the money supply curve, M. So why is it vertical? The reason the money supply curve is vertical, so first I have to say this. In reality, the money supply curve is not vertical, but in all first year textbooks, we work on the assumption that only the central bank supplies money. In reality, you'll remember that commercial banks can create money in the form of demand deposits. They cannot print money, but they can create money in the form of loans, and while in the form of demand deposits through loans or through overdraft facilities. But most first year textbooks, we ignore that when we do the graphical analysis, and we have a vertical line, and the vertical line is because the assumption is that only the Reserve Bank controls the money supply, nobody else. So remember that it is vertical because only the Reserve Bank or the central bank or the national bank controls the money supply. So how then would the interest rate change? The interest rate would change when the Reserve Bank increases or decreases the money supply. So in this particular instance, what you see is that when there's an increase in the money supply, and this is shown by M1 shifting to the right, always remember increases to the right because we're moving away from zero, away from the origin. So M2, you see now there's a new equilibrium interest rate and it is lower. So when the money supply increases, there's downward pressure on the interest rate and the interest rate is now lower. So think back to your supply and demand in the goods market. Whenever there was an increase in supply, it put downward pressure on the prices. Remember the agricultural market. So when there's a lot of avocados or there's a lot of bananas in the stores because we had a good harvest, a lot of bananas means downward pressure on the price of that banana. So likewise, in the money market, when there's an increase in supply, it puts downward pressure on the interest rate, as you can see over there. So that's how it looks. That's how that's money market equilibrium. Money market equilibrium is where the money supply curve and the demand for money curve intersect. So now you'll see on your handout there's a question, and I want you to draw the graph. There isn't really space below it. You could maybe draw it. Well, you could draw it there. So if you can take a pencil, ruler, I want everybody to draw the graph. Do you not have the handout? No, today's one. Remember, there's another handout that I brought today. So make sure you have it. Those of you watching at home, these handouts are on SunLearn under the section on money and monetary policy. And what I want you to do now is to answer the question at the bottom of the first page. So you're looking at money market equilibrium, that handout, and there's a question at the bottom of the page. So I want everybody first start with the initial position. I wonder if this document. I want to draw this now on the document camera, but I'm not sure if the people at home can see that. So what you want to draw is, start with the initial position. Remember, from your supply and demand, always the initial position. So what you will draw is the graph that you see on the screen without the M2 curve. Only M1 and L, and make that L1. So you won't have M2, and you won't have E2, and you won't have I2 and M2. So that's what I just want to show you that. So you start out with the initial position. And then the question asks, die geldmark is een, well, ek het die in vergeet. Die geldmark is in ewewig. So the question starts, the money market is in equilibrium. So the equilibrium would be just M1 and L1, no M2. Then the question goes on to say, explain with the aid of a graph what happens in the money market when there is economic growth. Die vraag dan, verduidelik met behulp van 'n grafiek wat gebeur in die geldmark wanneer daar ekonomiese groei is. Has everybody drawn the initial equilibrium? Initial equilibrium, people, draw, you need to practice. Some of you are not drawing the graph, why? I expect everybody to draw it. One of these graphs will be in the test, in test 3. I could give you a question exactly like this, or I could change one word. I could say, there's negative economic growth, which we are currently experiencing in South Africa. I don't know if you saw last week, the figures for economic growth or was earlier this week, came out, and it's minus 1 point something. So we are in a contraction phase at the moment. Our what does that negative number mean? It means compared to the previous quarter, our total production has gone down. Okay, so once you've drawn the initial position or initial equilibrium, now you have to know what to do with there's economic growth. So now you have to tell me, if there's economic growth, is the money supply going to change or the demand for money going to change? So indien daar ekonomiese groei is, gaan die vraag na geldkurwe skuif of gaan die geldaanbodkurwe skuif? Die ander woord vir geldaanbod is die geldvoorraad. Hulle praat van die geldvoorraad. So which one's going to change? Demand for money, based on what I've told you now today. Demand for money or the money supply? Uitstekend. Hy sê voor, die vraag na geld. En dit is die vraag na geld wat gaan verander. So wat julle nou doen is, teken L2, skuif dit na rechts. So what you do now is, draw L2, so you will shift the L curve to the right. You gave the correct answer. If there's economic growth, it means total production has increased. It means national income is higher. When people have more income, they spend more. So because they spend more, the transaction demand for money is going to rise, and sorry, the demand for money is going to shift to the right. So what you notice has happened, because the M curve hasn't moved, right? So you still have M1. What do you notice has happened? I just want to see some of your graphs. Okay, now but you guys have the M2. You mustn't have M2. Yeah, that's correct. You must only have M1 because the money supply has not changed. So you only have M1. So what you will notice in the graph is, so remember you weren't supposed to draw M2. The money supply has not changed. I said only draw the initial position. So the initial position would have just been M1 and L1. And then L shifted to the right. And what did you notice? What happened, for those of you who drew it correctly, who didn't have M2, or only has M1, what did you notice happened to the quantity of money? Those of you who drew the graph, yes. Jammer? Die geld hoeveelheid? Nee, die geld hoeveelheid is op die x-as. Okay, so die rentekoers het opgegaan, dis reg. Maar wat gebeur met die geld, die hoeveelheid geld? Dat is dieselfde gebly, ja. So, the interest rate went up, very well done. Die rentekoers het opgegaan, maar die geld hoeveelheid het dieselfde gebly. Hoekom? Onthou die aanname hier. Die aanname hier is net die reservebank, net die sentrale bank, kan die, of beheer die geldvoorraad. So the assumption here, remember, is that only the Reserve Bank controls the money supply. So it looks a bit funny, because you see the thing going up, but that's the interest rate going up. On the x-axis, nothing is, the money supply has not gone, the quantity of money has not changed. Now, again, I just want to tell you, this is a very simplified example. We work on the assumption that only the central bank controls the money supply. In the real world, The central bank is the only one who can print money, yes, but commercial banks can create demand deposits. Remember, demand deposits are part of M1. So commercial banks can do that. And so in the real world, this wouldn't apply, but this is what all first years would learn. So in introductory economics, this is the model we use. Based on the assumption, important, remember the assumption is only the central bank can control the money supply. Going to the second page, or the reverse. I just want to mention these two briefly, the difference between these two types of inflations. Do you have any questions? Enige vraag? Anything you're not sure about? Okay. So under inflation, you see something called demand pull inflation, and you see something called cost push inflation. So vraagtrekinflasie en kostendrukinflasie. So why are we discussing inflation here again? Because remember, the monetary policy framework in South Africa is inflation targeting. So you did a measurement of inflation in the first 2 weeks when we calculated CPI inflation. But now what we're looking at is we want to get to how does the government, not the government, the Reserve Bank, how does the Reserve Bank control inflation? Because price stability is what they want to do. So before you can do that, you need to know where the inflation is coming from. And it can either come from having a look at the graph. So ignore this graph now. What I want you to look at is the graphs on your handout, B, under B, and you see two graphs. So demand pull inflation, this is when inflation is happening because of increases in consumption or investment, increases in aggregate demand. So in terms of what is aggregate demand, remember when we did the formula for GDP? I can't remember if I did I do GDP with you? So C plus I plus G. Did we do that? We must have. Did we not do C plus I plus G plus net exports? Okay, forgive my memory at the moment. So, okay, then let's leave demand pull first for now, and let's talk about cost push inflation. So cost push inflation, this is when you'll see this comes from the supply side, and this would happen when things like oil prices go up, electricity goes up. So the costs for firms are going higher, and because the costs are rising, short-run aggregate supply will go down, and this pushes prices up. Okay, so I just want you to understand that some inflation comes from the cost side or from the supply side, and some come from the demand side. We'll go, I think I'll make a video about demand pull inflation and just a bit more about aggregate demand. But what I want you to understand is that in terms of policy, the Reserve Bank can control demand pull inflation, but they cannot control cost push inflation. Because, for example, if the oil price goes up, there's not much the Reserve Bank can do about that. We are not an oil producing country, for example. But if inflation's coming because people are spending a lot, so people are consuming a lot and demand is going up and up, what the Reserve Bank will then do is they will increase the interest rate in the hope that people will spend less. Okay. We've already mentioned inflation targeting. I'm not going to talk about open market transactions because that's in the video. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about that, but you can read it here. But that's in the video you need to watch. But you do need to know, as an economics student, that inflation targeting is a monetary policy. And it's been like this since 2000. You need to know what the target is. It's 3 to 6% of CPI. So does anyone remember from when we did the calculations for inflation? Are we currently within the target or outside of the target? Inside, very well, very good. So currently inflation is under 6%. It was 4 point something, I think. Or so in terms of monetary policy, we are doing well. The Reserve Bank is doing well. So inflation is not outside of the target. So what does the Reserve Bank do if they want to put downward pressure on inflation? If they see consumers are spending such a lot, and so consumption expenditure is going up, and now inflation is out of 6%, what the Reserve Bank then will do is they will increase the repo rate. So what is the repo rate? The repo rate is the rate at which the Reserve Bank lends money to commercial banks like Standard Bank, etc. So repo rate, the rate at which commercial banks borrow from the Reserve Bank, and that is closely linked to the prime rate, because if the Reserve Bank increases the repo rate, then commercial banks will increase the rate at which they borrow to, at which they lend money to us. And so when interest rates go up, people will spend a bit less and consumption will go down. Why do you think people will spend less when interest rates go up? Anybody? What type of spending specifically? Okay, there and then there, yes?
Because I think if they have to take out loans and stuff, the amount they have to pay back will go up.
Okay, very good. And what were you going to say? Okay, so basically, when the interest rate goes up, it becomes more expensive to use your credit cards. You don't want to use your credit card to just go to the movies or something frivolous because it's more expensive now. You're not likely to buy a new car because, cards you don't buy cash, you're buying on credit. So this is how the Reserve Bank works. But you'll see more of it in the video. That's it for today. So I will see you on Tuesday, and I'm going to send you an email about what you must do to prepare.